Welcome to the study of the book of Esther. This is the 5th week, and we're in the 5th chapter. And I'm not going to do it every time, but I want to call your attention to a set of commentaries that are produced by a fellow I had the pleasure of being in school with, Dr. Eddie Clore, the general editor of the Truth for Today commentary series. And this particular commentary that we're studying is written by Dr. Coy Roper, and I would recommend any of these series to you. People will ask, well, how much do they cost? They're just a little over $30. And about that time, people usually run pulling their hair out saying, $30? But if we stop and think about it a little bit, this book easily lasts 50, 60 years. You give it to your grandchildren, and it'll still be good. And you can't feed a family of 4 at a fast food restaurant for that kind of money. And yet the material that's here fills in a lot of historical information that fleshes out the context, helps you understand a lot of the dynamics of the society. There are word studies in there that look at the original language and give you insight into key religious terms that occur within these chapters. And I just recommend it to you. Of course, we know that at the end of the day, that the text itself is the authority. But there are people that have spent a lot of years that can help one to be able to appreciate with a greater depth of understanding what the text in fact says. Chapter 5, Esther has committed herself to approach the king, though she's not been summoned. She's taken her life into her hands. If he doesn't respond favorably to her, she'll be executed. The story of the triumph of the Jews begins here in chapter 5. After she agrees to Mordecai's request to intervene with the king, Esther approaches him, and she knows not whether he will accept her or not, whether she's going to live or going to die. And we'll see that the king welcomed her into his presence, and she invites him and this man Haman to a banquet that she's prepared. And at the banquet, she invites the two of them to another banquet the following day. And we see that the murderous Haman leaves full of himself, full of pride, only to be angered yet again by Mordecai's refusal to bow and scrape and honor him like he demands. He goes home, celebrates his successes with his wife and his friends, and he also confessed his bitter disappointment because of Mordecai's insubordination, his insolence. In response, they advise him to build a gallows and to have Mordecai executed on that gallows. And he agrees to that plan. He likes that. And he has it built. Let's begin looking at verses 1 through 4, where we'll see Queen Esther's successful approach to the king. Now it came about on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance of the palace. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, "What's troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be given to you." Esther said, "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Just as she had promised Mordecai, Esther went into the king's presence and seeks his help for her people. Come to verse 1. She's asked Mordecai to have the Jews in Susa to fast on her behalf for 3 days, and she and her maidens have done the same thing. That's chapter 4 and verse 16. Therefore, the phrase "on the third day" means when the fasting was completed. A scholar by the name of C.F. Kyle reckoned that the fast lasted from the afternoon of the first to the forenoon of the third day, between 40 and 45-hour fast. And at the end of that fast, Esther put on her royal robes. She had prepared spiritually for this encounter with fasting and prayer. Now she prepares herself physically, making herself as attractive as possible. And from what we've learned about her, it was very possible for her to make herself attractive. She's said to be a beautiful woman. And so putting on the royal robes probably implies that she did everything she could to appear regal and attractive. Royal robes is literally royalty, put on royalty, but the verb in the statement indicates the putting on of a garment. Esther wanted to appear before the king in her role as royalty, as the queen of Persia. Esther walks into the inner court of the king's palace, facing the throne room. The king's sitting on his royal throne in that throne room at the entrance, and apparently the king lives and conducts his business in a part of the palace complex which is designed solely for his use. In verse 2, suspense builds as the narrative reports that the king saw Esther, the queen, standing there in the court. The moment of truth has arrived. Would the king spare Esther's life or have her executed? The writer reports the king's verdict with these simple words: she obtained favor in his sight. The writer didn't explain why Esther found favor in the eyes of the king. Maybe something about seeing Queen Esther in her royal robes stirred memories of happier days. Or perhaps her there as a vision of beauty and loveliness pricked his conscience for his neglect of her and not having summoned her to spend time with him in 30 days. Perhaps he's just in a pleasant mood after receiving good news from some far-flung province. Or maybe he's just enjoyed a delicious lunch. One thing we do know, one thing that the believer can be sure of, is that however he had done it, God had prepared that man for this moment so that he would be glad to receive Esther. Mark Mangano cited Proverbs 12 and verse 1. The king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. And then Mangano suggested that the king's heart may have been changed by divine impulse. I think that's certainly likely. Maybe one would even be justified in saying obvious. The king extended to Esther the golden scepter, and she came near and touched the top of it. There are Persian reliefs that portray the king holding a scepter, a thin staff about the length of his body with a knob on one end. By Xerxes extending his scepter, Esther's life had been spared, and the first part of her plan has been a great success. In verse 3, the king obviously senses that Esther has a serious problem. I mean, she would not have risked her life to appear before him in this way if there were not something seriously amiss. And his good mood is evident in his words to his recently neglected queen. He asks, "What is troubling you?" And this question could be more literally translated, "What's with you?" The idiom is similar to the English expression, what's the matter? The king also asked, "What is your request?" And using hyperbolic language, he promised to give Esther anything she requested up until the half of the kingdom, even including half the kingdom. It is unlikely that he meant for that to be taken seriously. Joyce Baldwin argued that its inclusion here is a repetition, and its repetition later suggests that it was a conventional phrase and not intended to be taken literally. You know, we use hyperbole a lot in the southern parts of the United States where there's exaggeration for emphasis' sake. You know, I've heard people many times say, I'd give $1 million for a cool Coca-Cola on a hot day. And so it seems clear what's going on here. A similar offer was made in Mark 6:23, and we know that had disastrous effect for John the Baptist. And Xerxes is not doing that here. In verse 4, Esther had only one request. May the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him. The banquet's been prepared for him, singular, that is for the king. Haman was also invited, but the king was the primary recipient of the invitation. It is clearly an invitation to the king. Haman's inclusion appears to be almost an afterthought if it wasn't. Literally, the invitation in the Hebrew words reads this way: let the king come and Haman today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. Obviously, Esther had been doing more than fasting and praying in these 3 days. She's been busy. She's been planning her strategy, deciding what she's going to do, how she's going to approach this, how she's going to try to save the Jews. And she's been married to this man for 5 years or so. And so she knows him. And she knows that providing a good meal, a sumptuous meal for her husband was an effective way to win his approval and to make him receptive to what she had to say. The plan involves 2 banquets. The first is aimed at solidifying the king's affection and to disarm Haman by giving him the idea that she appreciates him. And the second is to request the king's help in saving her people and to confront Haman. So she's got 2 things in mind in 2 days. Esther needed to speak to Haman in the presence of the king to make sure he did not have the opportunity to deny the charge that she's going to make. She's setting him up to be exposed for the evil that he intends. The first banquet may already have been prepared when Esther invited the king to dine with her. The Babylonian Talmud discusses the purposes of Esther's inviting Haman to the banquet. It's a Jewish source, Jewish commentary on Scripture. And of the many suggestions that are made, there are 4 that are worthy of consideration. First, she was setting a trap for Haman, Rabbi Eleazar. Secondly, she wanted him to be at hand when she accused him, Rabbi Joseph. Thirdly, she didn't want to give him an opportunity to form a conspiracy and rebel, Rabbi Meir. And fourthly, she wanted to prevent Xerxes, an erratic king, from having time to change his mind, Rabban Gamaliel. All 4 of those are possible, and it may be a combination of all. Esther's deliberate inclusion of Haman, said Michael V. Fox, shows that she has a well-designed, well-crafted plan of attack. And she realizes that she's got to defeat this man quickly and certainly must prevent him from parlaying with the king and others behind her back. Now, these plans are consistent with Esther's emerging character as a careful and brilliant strategist. Naaman is up against his superior here. Since the king had made such an extravagant offer, why didn't Esther just immediately ask that the Jews be spared? Most likely she's already laid out her plans, and she knows what she's going to do and when she plans to do it, and she's confident that everything is in order and it will fall in place. And so she wisely doesn't change what's already established. Also, she probably knew that the king's promise to half his kingdom would easily be broken. He used his use of that expression was a whim. It's a momentary inclination that would leave as quickly as it came, especially if he had the opportunity to talk to others and ask what they thought about what he should do about the request. She wanted his promise to grant her request to be based on something more substantial. And she knew that he needed to say yes more than once before the decision was final. Again, she's been married to this man. She knows him. Verses 5 through 8, we are given an account of Esther's first banquet. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done." So Esther replied, "My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." So the king and Haman attend Esther's banquet. And as planned, she was in readiness to take her next step. In verse 5, the king kept his word. He did exactly as Esther had requested, what she desired, and immediately sent for Haman, and the two together go to the queen's quarters to attend the banquet which she has prepared. And judging by his reaction to this occasion, Haman, although he was the king's prime minister, was not accustomed to being asked to join the king when he dined with his queen. He was exceptionally pleased. He was profoundly flattered by this. Verse 6, during the dinner, as they drank their wine, the king again asked Esther what she desired. "What's your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request?" As in verse 3, he offers to give her whatever she wishes, even to half the kingdom. The mention of drinking wine may imply another part of Esther's plan to win the king's approval. People are generally more agreeable when their stomachs are full, and an individual's defenses are likely to be lowered by drinking wine. Make a note to yourself. Getting drunk, among other deleterious things, makes people susceptible to manipulation. Drinking was a prevalent part of banqueting in the Persian Empire. And as they drank their wine, as it says in verse 6, that's literally at the banquet of wine. Verses 7 and 8, Esther's second request was similar to her first. The king and Haman are asked to come again the next day to another banquet. And at that time, Esther explained that she would reveal what it was that she wanted the king to do. "I will do as the king says," literally according to the word of the king. This means I will then tell the king what's on my mind. The two banquets on successive days were designed to make the king more receptive to her request. They were, as has been said, a clever part of Esther's overall strategy. These fellows don't know it, but the lady is in charge in this circumstance. Verses 9 through 14, Haman's plot to have Mordecai executed is undertaken. Then Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, and he went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons and every instance where the king had magnified him and how he had promoted him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman also said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she'd prepared, and tomorrow I am invited by her with the king. Yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends said to him, "Have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet." And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. So as he leaves Esther's first banquet, Haman is again insulted. Who knows but what that's part of the plan. But he is insulted, we know, by Mordecai's insubordination. He discusses this matter with his wife and friends. That's what we get here. Verse 9, Haman, he's just full of himself. He's full of joy and pride at the invitation of this first banquet. And Carrie A. Moore translated this phrase, joyful and exuberant, explaining that exuberant is literally good of heart. The New International has happy and in high spirits. Haman felt this way because he was honored to dine with the king and his queen. And of course, he alone was given that honor. And his pride was punctured, however, when he passes Mordecai in the king's gate, and the Jew again refused to stand up or tremble in his presence. He's not going to do obeisance to this man, Haman. And in Haman's mind, that's a grave insult. According to Adele Berlin, the very presence of Mordecai is enough to upset Haman. But more than this, Mordecai is sitting. He doesn't rise. He doesn't stir, let alone bow. He doesn't grovel in Haman's presence. So Haman's happiness disappeared and his pride turns to anger against Mordecai. He allowed one Jew's failure to acknowledge his power to ruin his day, and in fact to ruin his life, to poison his character. In chapters 5 through 7, Haman, who is unquestionably the villain of the story, is at the same time both a comical, tragic figure, a buffoon. His puffed up pride is almost laughable, and the fact that he could become so upset because of one man's unwillingness to acknowledge his greatness is just pathetic. It's just almost sad. While he could manipulate the king, he himself could be manipulated and was manipulated by the queen. He saw himself as a person of power and influence, yet he himself was greatly influenced by others, by Mordecai's perceived disrespect, by Esther's flattery, by his friends' approval. Speaking of friends and approval, when people begin to tell you that you're better than you know you are, when you start reading positive press clippings and taking that seriously, this is just free advice, but you are headed for a fall. Not unlike Haman. Verse 10, in spite of his anger, Haman controlled himself. So at the end of this story, he's characterized more as a tragic buffoon than as an evil genius, and rightly so. In verse 10, he controls himself for the time being. He didn't immediately lash out personally at Mordecai. Instead, he goes home and he sends for his friends and his wife, and he tells them about his victories and his problem. It says these people were sent for. That is, he dispatched his servants to go find them wherever they were and bring them to the house. In verses 11 and 12, when they arrived, Haman recounts his reasons for boasting. I mean, yeah, he's boasting. He believes he has every reason to boast. He speaks of the glory of his riches, the number of his sons, his promotion by the king, in fact, numerous promotions by the king, ultimately to a position of preeminence and power and privilege, of being invited to the queen's banquet along with the king, all of these things. And in regard to Haman's sons, the Hebrew word that is translated number here literally means multitude. According to Rami ben Abba in the Talmud, Haman had 208 sons. However, that number is calculated by gematria. That's assigning number values to letters, and it shouldn't be taken seriously. Nevertheless, according to chapter 9 and verse 10 that we'll come to, he had at least 10 sons, and that's still a significant number of boys. Herodotus, the historian, wrote that the Persians believed that the chief proof of manliness is to be the father of a large family of boys. Well, he was that. Haman had all of those reasons to be grateful and to be thankful, but instead, he became arrogant and overbearing and let one person, not playing along with that, destroy his life. Verse 13, although Haman had many, many reasons to be grateful and contented, he confessed that he enjoyed no happiness or peace of mind because of the presence of this rebellious Mordecai. He said, yet all of this does not satisfy me, literally is not suitable to me. Apparently, neither he nor the others present saw anything strange about that confession. No one, it would seem, said anything like, wait a minute, Haman, now think about this a little bit. Think about what you have, and you got one guy over here who's not even Persian, and you're all uptight about that. Nobody gave that. So nobody said, why should you let the behavior of one man ruin your life when you have so much? Verse 14, Haman's wife and friends did, however, have a suggestion as to how he could solve his problem. They told him, have a gallows made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, advocating for the murder of an innocent man. Their point was that since Haman was in good favor with the king and had even shared food with him at the queen's table, he wouldn't refuse anything. The underlying Hebrew word translated gallows is a word that literally means tree or wood. And in this context, the wooden object was most likely a stake. A stake on which the Persians executed by impaling the victim. They didn't asphyxiate. According to Karen H., Jobes, both from written witness of Herodotus and from excavated stone reliefs, we know that the Persians built gallows that were wooden stakes on which they impaled, not asphyxiated their victims. It was suggested to Haman that he build the gallows 50 cubits high, that is 75 feet, Why these dimensions, since no gallows needs to be that tall in order to serve its purpose? Perhaps Haman's friends didn't intend for that suggestion to be taken literally. Like it's a phrase like hang 'em high, possibly. But the text doesn't say that Haman actually built it that high. It just says that was suggested. If the gallows was built on top of a palace wall, it would have been every bit of that tall. However, those arguments all carry very little weight because chapter 7, verse 9 repeats the height of the gallows, 50 cubits, 75 feet, and says it was built at Haman's house, not at the palace. And such a lofty height demonstrates the burning desire of Haman and his supporters to make a spectacle out of this man, Mordecai. They want all the people of Susa to see that. Isn't that sick? Isn't that pathetic? That's how they are in their heart. You see where people get to with no God, without the real God. They wanted to bring shame and disgrace upon the Jew who had defied Haman's authority. This advice pleased Haman because he's a pagan and he has no real God. So he had the gallows built, and he believed his problem would soon be solved. His enemy would be dead, and he could enjoy going to the second banquet the queen was preparing for him and the king, and then he could live happily basking in his power and his prosperity. From the standpoint of Haman and his friends, the gallows and Mordecai's execution would solve all his problems, and nothing further from the truth could be. In contrast, the future of the Jews at this moment looks dark indeed. Mordecai is about to be hanged, to be impaled, and the Jews' hope for salvation might very well perish with him. And so in chapter 5, we see again the character of these people come in bold relief. And at the end of the chapter, we see what a small, vile, repugnant person that this man Haman was. And apparently that's characteristic of his family and characteristic of the culture in which he lives. The Proverbs writer, the wise man, said, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And indeed, this is an example of that truth. I hope that you'll be with us next time as we go to chapter 6. May God bless you.